I want to talk to you guys about several stories in the Polish press that really reflect the nationalist problem that Ukraine has. For one, there is a Polish official by the name of Leszek Miller who is disappointed with Zelensky. He was the prime minister of Poland back in the early 2000s, and he is currently a member of the European Parliament. Leszek Miller expressed his sadness and disappointment over Zelensky's recent diplomatic trip in Poland because during his trip, Zelensky did not mention, neither in public nor in private, the Volyn massacre. And this has been a huge issue between Ukraine and Poland for decades, really ever since the end of the Second World War. This has been a huge diplomatic issue between the countries. And the reason for this is because Ukraine has never really faced up to the reality of this evil. Ukraine has never really expressed accountability, sincerely expressed accountability for this crime. And truly what reflects this absence of accountability is the fact that Ukraine glorifies the murderers. Ukraine glorifies the OUN, it glorifies Bandera, it glorifies Andrei Melnik, people who were involved in the mass slaughter of Polish civilians. And if you have not read about the massacre of the Poles in the 1940s, I highly encourage you to do so, although it is very disturbing. We're talking about pregnant women being eviscerated, their unborn babies ripped out from their wombs, people cut to pieces with axes, people burned alive. Really horrific stuff. We're talking Armenian genocide tier level evil. And like Turkey, Ukraine has never really sincerely expressed remorse for this crime. And so this has been a huge issue. It's been a deep-seated issue with a lot of untreated wounds in Poland due to this absence of accountability. So Zelensky comes to Poland, does not bring up the Volyn massacre at all, even though he is Jewish, and the Volyn massacre was done by people who were backed by the German Nazis, backed by the Third Reich. He didn't bring this up. He could have said, I am Jewish, I have family who suffered in the Holocaust, relatives of mine were butchered in the Holocaust in Ukraine. We share a common history of despair and turmoil. We were both persecuted by these very monsters. That was not mentioned at all. Okay. There is another story in the Polish press that reflects the nationalist problem of Ukraine, and that is the fact that when Zelensky was in his diplomatic trip in Poland and he was making this grand speech and he was doing this press conference, he had a sweater. He had a sweater with the symbol of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalist, better known as its acronym, the OUN, on his sweater. The symbol was on his sweater, and you can see it. And according to the Polish publication Kresy, it says here that during official meetings with representatives of the highest authorities of Poland, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky wore a sweatshirt with the emblem of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. During his speech at the Royal Castle in Warsaw, he raised the Bandera salute together with the crowd. Going on in this article, it says, during his visit, Zelensky officially presented elements of the OUN and the UPA symbols. This was evident from the very beginning of the visit. When he arrived at the presidential palace for a meeting with President Andrzej Duda, president of Poland, he was wearing a black sweatshirt with the emblems of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. It's about the symbol of the Ukrainian Trezub, with the sword. This is the historical emblem of this organization. And it says here, later after the split in 1940, it was a symbol of the Melnik faction. There was a split within the organization of Ukrainian nationalists between Bandera and Melnik. And according to this article, the symbol that Zelensky was wearing on his sweatshirt was the symbol of the Melnik faction, the O-U-N-M, M standing for Melnik. Andrei Melnik was one of the orchestrators of the Volyn massacre. He was also a Nazi collaborator. And here is another example, also from the Polish press. And this story was highly, highly underreported. Okay, it was really not reported at all in the mainstream English-speaking media. And if it was a tiny little blurb on the corner of some publication. Last year, Zelensky gave an award to a Ukrainian mass murderer, an old Ukrainian nationalist who butchered an entire Polish village. His name is Miroslav Szymczyk. And he was a fighter for the organization of Ukrainian Nationalist, whose very symbol Zelensky wears. And his nickname is Kryzvonos. This guy slaughtered an entire village. The village was called Pristin, or Pistin, in the Stanislavov Voivodeship. And the Zelensky government awarded this mass murderer the title of Hero of Ukraine. He was given the title of Hero of Ukraine by Volodymyr Zelensky. And this guy was a mass murderer. And here is the Zelensky government giving him an award. And it says here that the 99-year-old Szymczyk, in accordance with the presidential decree, meaning Zelensky's decree, was awarded the Order of the Golden Star and the title of Hero of Ukraine. He was presented as, quote, a military man, a social activist, a sotnik of the Ukrainian insurgent army, and a prisoner of communist camps. Well, there's a reason why they put him in a camp. There's a reason why. It's not like, this isn't some Jordan Peterson a worldview here. They put people in camps. The reality is that they put this guy in a camp because he was a murderer. It's not like everybody that was put in a camp by the Soviets were innocent victims who were just being terribly treated by the Soviets because the Soviets felt like just being evil. No, this isn't. I'm not following the Jordan Peterson paradigm here. This guy was put in a camp because he was a murderer, but he is presented as a martyr or as someone who's persecuted, etc., by the evil communists and so on and so forth. The reality is that this guy was a mass murderer, and he is given this award by the Zelensky government. And it really flies into the face of this whole narrative that, well, you can't say that Ukraine has a Nazi problem because the leader of Ukraine is Jewish. The president of Ukraine is Jewish. See, this is why I prefer to say that Ukraine has a nationalist problem. Because the problem with just saying it has a Nazi problem, the issue that I have with just saying that it has a Nazi problem, is that people could then counter-argue and say that, well, for one, Zelensky is Jewish, and secondly, the OUN fought against the Nazis. So they'll say, well, it doesn't have a Nazi problem because these heroes that Ukraine praises fought the Nazis. The OUN fought the Nazis, which is true. The OUN, Ukrainian nationalists, fought the Nazis. But it wasn't for the right reason. It wasn't like they were fighting the Nazis because the Nazis were evil. It was a power struggle. The OUN wanted Ukrainian independence. And the Germans simply wanted to use the Ukrainians as tools. Hitler said that the Slavs only serve one purpose, and that is to serve the Germans. That is to be basically slaves to the Germans. And the Ukrainians were not exempt from this paradigm. They weren't exempt from this ideology. The Germans saw the Slavs as slaves, and they saw the Ukrainians no differently. They simply wanted to use the Ukrainians as a proxy against the Soviets. The Ukrainians said, oh, well, we're getting backed by the Germans, so let's declare independence. And Stepan Bandera declared independence, and he ended up in a camp. He ended up getting arrested, and he ended up being confined by the Nazis. Not because he was fighting the evils of fascism. No. It's because he wanted an independent Ukraine. And the Germans simply wanted Ukraine to be just more territory for the German Lebensraum, the German living space. It had nothing to do with fighting fascism. In fact, the Ukrainians, they did a lot of the horrific, bloody work for the Germans. They butchered tens of thousands of Poles, and this was in accordance with Germany's aspiration of exterminating the Polish race. The Germans wanted to exterminate the Polish people, and the Ukrainians were doing just that. They were doing what the Germans wanted, so the Germans supported them. But when it came down to the OUN wanting an independent Ukraine, the Germans said, no. So I prefer to say that Ukraine has a nationalist problem. That way it cancels out this counter-argument that, well, you can't say it has a Nazi problem because Zelensky is Jewish. Because Jews can be racist and ultra-nationalist, just like anyone else. You can have Jewish Americans who are hardcore American right-wingers, and they can be very racist. Trust me, I've seen them. Just like you can have Ukrainian Jews who support Ukrainian ultra-nationalism. So I prefer to say that Ukraine has a nationalist problem, because if you say that Ukraine has a Nazi problem, they can say, whoa, Zelensky's Jewish, how can you say that? If you say Ukraine has a nationalist problem, it's actually more accurate. It not only anticipates the counter-arguments, it's actually more accurate, because of the fact that the OUN fought the Nazis. The OUN were an organization of Ukrainian nationalists who wanted independence for Ukraine. If that meant working with the Germans, they would work with the Germans. If that meant working with the Americans, they would work with the Americans. They were equal opportunists. And so when we say that Ukraine has a nationalist problem, we are addressing the OUN issue. Regardless of the fact that the OUN fought the Nazis, we're addressing the sinister reality of the OUN. We are addressing the sinister reality of the political cult that exists in Ukraine, the political cult that glorifies mass murderers. We're addressing all that. And when the counter-argument comes, when the argument of the tares comes, and they say, well, Zelensky's a Jew, we say, well, we're not saying that Ukraine has a Nazi problem. We're saying that Ukraine has a nationalist problem, which needs to be addressed. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.
Biedny ja, biedny ja. Potargano chałupa, słonko na niej świeci. Godała mi moja miła, że mnie rada widzi. Jako mały nie pójdę, a do duży nie śmiem. Poby się mnie opytała, czemu w doma nie śpiem. Poby się mnie opytała, czemu w doma nie śpiem. Nie śpiem, czemu w doma nie śpiem. Potargano chałupa. bo by się mnie opytała, czemu w doma nie śpiem, bo by się mnie opytała, czemu w doma nie śpiem, czemu w doma nie śpiem. Biedny jo, jak to ta bezwolna.